So imagine, if you will, being dropped off somewhere in Pennsylvania in the heart of Amish country, and you've been dropped off at an Amish farm, and you're told that you're going to live there for a year, and not just live there observing, you're going to live there and become Amish yourself. Now, for most of us, certainly for me, this would be an incredibly difficult transition. Not just leaving technology behind or social media behind or my way of life behind, but I would be entering what would be for me functionally a complete alternative universe, a parallel society that I don't even know how to navigate. And yet here it is, living right in the midst of a secular society, a whole parallel universe, a parallel society, fully functional, seemingly not needing the secular culture around it, but able to carve out a niche, a life of their own. And so after a year, I'd be dressing differently, eating differently, working differently. I would have different rhythms to my day. I'd be immersed into an entirely new language. I would have a different perspective on religion, even though both the Amish and someone like myself, a Methodist, would call ourselves Christian. Well, Christian nationalism is similar to that little parable. Tonight, you're going to hear and learn how a parallel alternate society has been built up inside our own primarily secular world. In our world, it's a world where we glory in governments set up by we the people, self-governance, not governance by God. Governments set up to have competing spheres of power, of interest. There's the legislative and the judicial and the executive branches of government. There's the media and the market and the military and religion, so that one sphere does not dominate all the spheres. They're competing spheres of power. Tonight we'll hear and learn about a political virus that is destructive of democracy, that desires to collapse all of the spheres into one, a virus that is destructive of Christianity, desiring a return to this monolithic Christendom, a society of purity and obedience and punishment. We're going to learn why it's so difficult to talk to our extended family members. Why has Christianity become so utterly incomprehensible? Are we talking about Jesus, the king and the conqueror, or Jesus, the victim, the friend of the damned? We're going to learn about a movement in society that has constructed its own infrastructure, has massive amounts of money, has its own media and military, and even its own hermeneutic of truth. You might remember early on in the Trump administration, Kellyanne Conway called them alternate facts. And we were all kind of baffled. What's she talking about? But she was being literal, revealing a portrait of reality unknown to the American public. Tonight, you'll learn about what we're really up against in our political squabbles of Republican versus Democrat, what we're up against in our cultural divides about inclusion and gender rights and about the control of our bodies. When tonight is over, you're going to know about how deeply white supremacy is interwoven with all of these spheres of power. And you're going to learn how this virus is spreading throughout the globe. By way of, well, before I introduce our speaker, Katherine, with us, I just wanted you to know that the format tonight, the format of this webinar is Katherine and I, well, first Katherine's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then she and I will engage in a little Q&A back and forth, a conversation. And then there's gonna be at least an hour for the audience, for y'all, to engage in that same Q&A. And so to create some form of order and coherence, that's what that Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen at any time that you want. You can begin writing and asking in your questions. We have a young scholar with us who is going to sort through them, find the patterns, and he'll be the one that will facilitate those questions. But as the event goes on, please do participate in that way. You'll notice there'll be some announcements at the end, but you'll notice that this is being recorded. We'll put it up on a website, and we want to invite you to participate as much as you can. For those who really get turned on, there's also a little book group emerging to follow up on tonight. So with that, let me introduce Katherine, and I'm going to keep it short. I just think she is a wonderful scholar. She's written 2 books, and the first book was The Good News Club, and that's when she stumbled onto this Christian nationalist project. And she has gone on to do a deep, deep dive into the right wing of this country. And so with that, and that's her book right behind me, by the way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Katherine, and just take us where you want us to go.
I met Rich Lang years ago, about 10 years ago, when one of his congregants was very upset about a Good News Club that had appeared in his public school. Good News Clubs, as I mentioned earlier, these after-school clubs that install themselves inside public schools around the country and try to indoctrinate very young kids in a very fundamentalist form of Christianity, and they target children in their very earliest years of learning. And the key thing about these Good News Clubs is they confuse children into thinking that the religion of the clubs is endorsed by the public school. So when this club appeared in a Ballard school, it really alienated a lot of these public school families. It divided a formerly harmonious community along lines of ethnicity, faith, and unfortunately politics. It's a club that claims to teach morals and values, but it set child against child, neighbor against neighbor, and Christian against Christian all too often. So I came to Seattle to investigate. I didn't really know what I was looking at. Rich Lang knew exactly what we were seeing here. He started his professional training at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago before embracing a form of faith that is very social justice oriented and also committed to the social gospel and is unafraid of questions. So he really understood fundamentalism and had a profound grasp of its political and social implications. He laid out for me very slowly and patiently and carefully the understanding of the larger movement behind Good News Clubs. That early conversation I had with him was so important to me. He understood their aims and their methods, and above all, their radicalism. Now, I just want to make sure everybody can hear what I'm saying. Can you hear me?
Yes, Katherine, we can hear you fine. Okay. Thank you.
All right, super. Just checking in. So toward the end of that first visit at Reverend Lang's office at the Trinity United Methodist Church, he used a word that frankly shocked me. Okay, Reverend Lang, I have to admit, I was taken aback. You used the word fascism. When I heard you say it, I have to admit, I cringed a bit inside. That kind of language made me deeply uncomfortable. I thought, fascism? Surely this must be a bit of an exaggeration. Yes, Good News Clubs were divisive. And yes, they appeared to run counter to all of the small town values and family values that the religious right claimed that they stood for. But you know, I'd met some of the Good News Club leaders. They seemed like nice people. And you know, I assumed we all really at the end of the day wanted the same things, didn't we? Strong communities, happy, stable families, a just society, a prosperous country, and good public schools where children of all ethnic and faith backgrounds could thrive and feel comfortable, right? I mean, this was 10 years ago. Obama was in office, and I was at the start of my journey into this world. I was so naive. Reverend Rich Lang was not. So today I'm here to tell you what we often think of as the religious right doesn't exist in the same way as we often think about it. Many people think of it as a culture war, preoccupied with things like abortion and same-sex marriage. But that framework is inadequate to understanding the challenges that we're facing. Christian nationalism makes use of religion, but it's not just trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It's really trying to achieve political power. And it is an anti-democratic movement because it says that the foundation of legitimate government in the United States is a strict interpretation of a particular religion. The consensus is still in some quarters to view the religious right through that culture war frame. The point of my book, The Good News Club, The Power Worshippers, is that that framework is not adequate. The movement has changed. It's not a social conservative movement. It's really, the right points of comparison, allowing for some differences of detail, of course, are the religious nationalist movements in countries like Hungary, Turkey, and Russia. When leaders of those countries bind themselves tightly to religious conservative figures to consolidate an authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. And that's what we're seeing today with Trump and his alliances with hyper-conservative religious leaders. I also think it's helpful in understanding the movement to distinguish between the leaders and the rank and file. When we're talking about the rank and file, we are talking about a very wide range of people with very different interests, backgrounds, and ideas. A very substantial number of the movement's supporters would be unhappy to learn all of the details of what their leaders are proposing. A lot of them are really voting identity and not just policy. When they vote for the candidate who promises to end abortion, for instance, they aren't explicitly aiming for major fundamental changes in the way American government is organized. They're really making a statement about who they are and what they value in themselves. But for the leaders of the movement, which are the heads of the religious right policy groups, the networking groups, the media and legislative initiatives, the legal organizations, the data initiatives and the like, these are sort of different components of the machinery of the movement. Their vision, like the leadership of that machinery, involves a lot more power for themselves and their networks. And for the political leaders that they support, many are looking forward to a time when only what they call Christians, in their approved versions of the religion, they have very specific ideas about what forms of Christianity are acceptable. So they're looking for a time when their people, right, are in charge of all major areas of government and society. They're also looking forward to a time when they can rely on government for two things, which is a constant flow of taxpayer money and also policies that privilege members of their conservative interpretation of the Christian religion. So how much power do they have? I mean, we can start with the 2016 election. Trump got elected by making a deal with Christian nationalist leaders who are the architects of the right-wing voter turnout machine. As a consequence, he won a higher share of the rank and file's votes than any of his Republican predecessors. And he really has worked overtime since then to repay these leaders for their loyalty. He's actually always reminding them at these public events like Marches for Life and Values Voters Conference. He's saying, I think I gave you everything you wanted, and I think I actually gave you more. And he's right. He's appointed judges favorable to their interests. He's enacted the economic policies that are favorable to the movement's ultra-rich funders. He's promised conservative religious organizations a steady flow of federal dollars. And he has granted leaders of the movement, his allies, unparalleled political access and power. And these leaders in turn have elevated his presidency to the level of biblical prophecy. They're always comparing him to biblical kings like King David or King Cyrus, an imperfect vessel through which God achieves his goals. So there are a lot of components to the machinery of the movement, as I alluded to earlier. I'm just going to give you an example of how that machinery works, focusing specifically on conservative-leaning churches. Leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive votes, and so they organize sympathetic pastors into networks that get them all on the same page politically and give them tools to help them turn out the votes for hyper-conservative political candidates. So I want to give you an idea of what this looks like on the ground. Recently, I found myself at a small church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter and the supposedly biblically correct way to vote on them. The event was organized by Watchmen on the Wall. It's a pastoral network It's a project of the Family Research Council. Do any of you know them? The Family Research Council is one of the most important policy groups of the Christian right. Watchmen on the Wall claims to have over 27,000 pastor members, and it's been openly endorsed by a number of Republican political leaders, like including Vice President Mike Pence. So I walked into this church with a friend of mine who also happens to be a pastor. His church is a member of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's actually quite politically progressive. So we were at this event, and we could tell immediately that this was not a politically neutral affair. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, who spoke at the event, said, "I believe this last election, 2016, was the result of prayer. We've seen our nation begin to move back to a nation that respects the sanctity of life." So what he was signaling here is that the single issue that matters most, that pastors should care about, is abortion. They know that if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So quoting from the book of Ephesians, Perkins told the pastors, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the wiles of the devil." I mean, we're all familiar with this passage, but Perkins implied something else with this passage. It was clear from his speech that the so-called wiles of the devil were to be found on the Democratic side of the aisle. The members of your congregations need to vote, he told the pastors. As pastors, you need to, I'm not going to say challenge them, you need to tell them to vote. So there wasn't the slightest doubt about which way Perkins expected pastors to tell their congregants to vote. And then he told the pastors, he and other leaders who were speaking instructed the pastors to form culture impact teams, which are supposed to, what they call it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. They had these materials on hand. This is a culture impact team manual. It's got, you'll see about, 200 pages of material. And so the way that this works is that pastors are instructed to figure out which members of the congregation are politically active, well connected with other members, and motivated to get them to vote according to their so-called biblical values. And then they give them comprehensive tools like this to do it. So, it's a very sophisticated tool. They're not just saying to the pastors, you need to get everybody to vote. You got to figure out who can get the vote out. They give them these really sophisticated tools to do it. And they give them other teams like voter guides. And there's a film that they showed that was available to show in church. And all of these materials are directed to sort of get people out to vote this sort of a certain way. It always boils down to, the issues end up being the issues that are in alignment with the hyper-conservative Republican candidates that the movement favors. So I'm going to tell you something about the political messaging of the movement leaders when they're talking to congregations or talking to pastors about talking to congregants. It's all abortion all the time. In fact, I heard at one event a leader tell a group of pastors, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you ask them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? I mean, when you put it that way, there's it's a leading question. But when you look at the political messages in more detail, and especially the ones that they're sending to one another and to the elites in power and the funders of the movement, it's not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money, about how the Bible favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors minimal government or no government regulation of business, how the Bible is against the social safety net unless the tax dollars are flowing through the church. Even in this manual, there's when they talk about the environment, there's one resource they direct readers to, and it's the Cornwall Alliance, which asserts that, has asserted, in fact, that environmentalism is a false theology. They actually produced a series called The Green Dragon, referring to environmentalism as the green dragon, sort of the green, a dragon is like a serpent, isn't it? So the symbolism is pretty rich. So let's talk about the ideology of the movement leaders. People continue to characterize the movement as conservative because it's hard to find language to describe what we're seeing. Sometimes words fail us when we're looking at a movement. You know, I actually use a number of terms to describe the movement, including Christian right, religious nationalism, Christian nationalism at times. But you know, the fact is there's nothing remotely conservative about this larger movement and its leadership. I think the correct word is actually radical. I learned a lot about the radicalism of these movement leaders, not only from Reverend Lang, but also when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger, the founder of an organization called Capital Ministries. What he does is he ministers to political leaders at the highest levels of government, the absolute top levels. I mean, Drollinger's weekly Bible study in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 current and former members of Trump's cabinet. He also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and the House of Representatives. So he's arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America today. Now the expansive, and he's got a huge like international kind of organization component to his organization. So he's making common cause with political leaders around the world right now. It's actually kind of shocking. The expansiveness of his positions on domestic, economic, foreign policy hits home the fact that this is not a political movement. This is, that this is a political movement. It's not, you know, just a stance in the culture war. He's not just sort of, you know, bringing Jesus and love and light to these folks. He's actually advocating very specific domestic policies and economic policies. And he actually produces books. This is one of his, it's a lot of fun to read. And here's like one of his Bible study guides. Some of them are printed up. Most of them are online. Anybody can look at them. He's not hiding. This one is Solomon's advice on how to eliminate a 20.5 trillion debt. And it's all about economic policy. I mean, it's really kind of very, very detailed. And this is what he's teaching to political leaders. So his teachings include the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He is, of course, against progressive income taxes, taxing the rich proportionately, against government regulation of businesses. He has referred to environmentalism too as a false religion. We're noticing a theme in the stance toward environmentalism here, and sound environmental policy. Or you could even call it creation care. But whatever it is, they're seeing this as a kind of false religion. Drollinger also has words of wisdom for laborers too, and for the workforce. In a Bible study titled Toward a Better Biblical Understanding of Lawmaking, it's probably still up on his website, he cites from the New Testament, the first letter of Peter 2:18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. So there are a lot of ways to interpret and read this Bible passage, but here's what Drollinger has to say about it. He says the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was one of slave and master. The principle today of submitting to one's boss carries over to today, submitting. So he's actually using this, submitting not only to your masters who are good and reasonable, but also to those who are unreasonable. It's worth thinking about, isn't it? Now, this is all music to the ears of business leaders, many of whom rely on minimal workers' rights and economic and environmental deregulation to maintain and increase their profits. This ideology, as I explain in my book, has roots in mid-century opposition to the New Deal. And even further back than that, there are roots to some of these ideas in pro-slavery theology. It really couldn't be any more different from progressive Christian theology that emphasizes racial justice, fairness and equality, love and care for the poor and the undefended. It's an idea of America as a supposedly orthodox Christian nation, rooted in hierarchies ordained by God. And it is widely parroted by other members of the movement, including David Barton, Do any of you know who he is? I know Rich Lang does. He's a historical revisionist who I call the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement, because he sits on the boards of so many of its initiatives. So for Barton, like other movement leaders, when it comes to voting, a lawmaker's particular stance on abortion signals alignment with far-right economic policy. Barton has said, if you're wrong on the life issue, this is an interview, I think, with the Christian Post, he said, if you're wrong on the life issue, you're not going to protect the Second and Fifth Amendments, marriage and property rights. So see how if you can get the vote to hinge on one thing and bring in a whole range of other policies, it's very politically expedient. At political events, he's actually displayed an example of congressional scorecards and said, if Congress won't protect life, they won't protect your money. So Barton, like Drollinger, argues that the Bible and God support particular policies that favor the rich and hollow out the social safety net. You know, they say that God wants this, and he exploits and distorts the issue of slavery to make a point. I want to show you something he published. It was on his website, so I printed it out. Wall Builders is his website. The Bible study, the study that he has here is called The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders. And so he wrote in this thing he said, okay, so he said, sinful man will always live in some form of bondage and slavery. As a slave to the state, to a noble or lord, or to other men, then he says, since sinful man tends to live in bondage, different forms of slavery have replaced the more obvious system of past centuries. And here he was referring to the enslavement of human beings. He says, the state has assumed the role of master for many, providing aid and assistance, and with it more and more control. To those unable to provide for themselves, the only solution to slavery is the liberty of the gospel, not the Constitution, not the law. You know what, if this sounds offensive to you or to so many of you, it's because it is. First off, in this passage, Barton is attempting to deracialize and whitewash, as it were, the specific institution of slavery in America, which caused so much pain and continues to cause so much pain today. And today he's actually trying to cast the social safety net, things like job training and medical care and food aid, as a form of slavery. It is just wrong on so many levels. While movement leaders oppose what they call government handouts to the poor, they have no problem at all with government handouts and other free goodies to conservative religious organizations. The movement has learned to siphon public money through subsidies, tax deductions, grants, vouchers, and other schemes, and they want to increase that flow of funds in ways that allow them to take public dollars, even as they discriminate and proselytize, all in the name of so-called religious liberty. So I want to explain very quickly how public subsidies are actually disproportionately aiding the Christian nationalist movement, and hence the candidates that they favor, by focusing on a data initiative that I wrote about in my book that they used to turn out the vote. One of the right-wing data organizations I feature is called United in Purpose, and it's a massive data organization. They use individual profiling and targeting to turn out voters for the far-right candidates that the movement favors. They identify a lot of these voters through conservative church membership lists, as well as membership in organizations opposing marriage equality and reproductive justice, even if a person is like a fan of NASCAR or fishing. So that'll give you a point, and that'll sort of, if you get enough points, according to things that its founder, Bill Dallas, has said, that's when they target you to try and get you to vote. So its founder, Bill Dallas, has not been shy in describing the massive reach of his data operation. He said in a September 5, 2016 interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, he gave an interview in which he said, we have about 200 million files, meaning voter files. So we've pretty much the whole voting population in our database. What we do is we track to see what's going to make someone either vote one way or not vote at all. I think that's another quote worth thinking about. United in Purpose has a number, very large number of initiatives, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to describe one of them. It's just one tiny piece of the larger United in Purpose puzzle, but it's worth bringing up because it shows how strategic it is. So Project 75 is a pastor-focused initiative which aims at, as they call it, mobilizing 75% of church members to vote. And if you can get people out in larger numbers, you can, get what you want in elections. The program features voter lookup tools allowing pastors to look up individuals from each church database, and they provide reports on what percentage of a congregation is registered to vote, what percentage actually voted in the last election, and then after each election, they provide follow-up reports to track progress. So it gives a pastor a lot of power. They can sort of compare congregation lists to voter rolls and figure out what percentage of them voted in the last election. Then they have this tool where they can actually look up individual congregants and see if they voted. I mean, you can imagine the conversations that could happen after that. Mrs. Jones, I noticed you didn't vote in the last election. Don't you know it's your, we have a biblical duty to, vote our values. So in 2016, last presidential election, United in Purpose was at the epicenter of a dense web of faith-based initiatives, all aimed at turning out conservative voters for Trump and Pence. Now, of course, all political operations use data and activist networks to increase their effectiveness in elections, but United in Purpose's voter turnout machine is at the top of a long pyramid that largely operates in the religious sphere, almost all of which is exempt from taxes, and of course, shielded from public scrutiny, because as faith-based organizations, they don't really have to, churches don't have to open up their books to the public the same way that other organizations do. So, the rise of religious nationalism should alarm us, but it should not be the cause of despair. Overcoming this kind of reactionary and authoritarian movement isn't just something Americans can do. It has made Americans what we are. The faith community has a critical role to play. Progressive leaders are standing up and challenging the politics of domination and conquest that this movement represents. But they will get nowhere, of course, unless congregants stand alongside them and speak up too. We have a responsibility to inquire of our fellow citizens. What kind of ideology are they supporting? One that embraces equality and difference and justice in our society, racial justice, sort of economic fairness and justice and other forms of equity? Or are they embracing an ideology that demands conformity and control? Do they embrace an ideology that emphasizes love and the message of love in the gospel, or one that targets specific groups for hate? But we're not going to defeat the clever and determined strategists of the religious right with a wet noodle full of love and good intentions. That's just not going to work. There's a very seasoned and highly influential religious rights strategist, Ralph Reed. He's the head of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. It's one of their key strategy groups. And he said that all that really matters is who shows up in the voting booth on election day. And he's right about that. I mean, the challenges we face are political, and the solutions are political too. There are things that we can do as individuals, and there are other parts of the solution that give us the opportunity to join with others and cooperate in larger initiatives. The right has invested in all the tools of modern campaign infrastructure, data, media, and messaging. They understand the necessity of unity in winning elections, of creating a positive voting culture. They understand the importance of collective initiatives, and above all, the value of the vote. These tools are available to all of us. Let's take our values to the ballot box and hold others accountable. Get to know your local lawmakers. Connect with the larger organizations to affect the changes that you want to see. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to end democracy, and we can use those same resources to restore it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Catherine. I want to pick up on the ideology and this kind of to maybe even squirrel us back to to some of the beginnings of what has happened in Christianity today. And that's one of the powerful strengths of your book, is that every chapter, all the subject matter that you bring up, you tie it in to persons. And so we both learn the story of a person, and then we learn how that person is an influential influence peddler, essentially. And you bring up a theologian who is super renowned in the, for lack of a better word, in the conservative part of the church, but almost utterly unknown to a moderate or liberal Christian. And that's a guy named R.J. Rushdoony. And part of his story is how his theology, which has so impacted Christianity today, is rooted in the ideology of slave owners and slave holders. And so if you could just pick up that story, who is this mysterious figure, R.J. Rushdoony?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing him up. The main thing to know about Rushdoony is that he was intensely hostile to the principle of equality. He endorsed kind of austere biblical literalism and rigid hierarchies, which he claimed were ordained by God. He saw it as his job to rescue America from its commitment to what he called godless secularism. So his theology also included an opposition to government assistance to the poor. He cast social welfare programs as slavery to the state. So he actually shares a lot with the Christian nationalist leaders today, the idea of America as an authentically Christian nation, tasked with becoming an Orthodox Christian republic, the idea that at some point America deviated horribly from its mission and fell under the control of atheist or liberal elites. This was really the lifeblood of his thought. So I've actually set aside some of his books. When I was researching my book, I sort of fell down a Rushdoony rabbit hole because I found him so fascinating, and I found echoes of his work, or even stuff that, like, ideas that he had sort of come up with in the work today. Sometimes adopted, the lines would be adopted, like, quotes without attribution, because Rushdoony was at a certain point sort of identified as being a little bit harsh. So people many Christian nationalist leaders kind of wanted to disavow their connections with him. But I'm just going to read from 3 books. I have about almost 2 dozen others in my bookshelf, because really the guy was incredibly prolific. So let's just find a couple of quotes here, and they're going to sound a little familiar to you. Okay, let's see. Well, this is really horrible. But let's start with this one. The Nature of the American System. He writes, the Constitution was designed to perpetuate a Christian order. Okay, so that's basically him saying that America was founded as a Christian nation, and then he also writes here, the freedom of the First Amendment from federal interference is not from religion, but for religion. This is something that has become an article of faith among the rank and file. This is something David Barton says. This is just a very commonly cited quote here. And then there's another, there are just like so many. I mean, I could just spend the rest of the night reading fun Rushdoony quotes to you, but I won't. That would be painful. Oh yeah, so here he talks about the 14th Amendment, which, he was really against the 14th Amendment, which is the end of slavery. Of course, he said, okay, there began the court's recession. He's talking about the 14th, from its conception of America as a Christian country and its development of the thesis of unitary state. So and the court embraced moral relativism as its religious principle and denial of higher law. So he just thought that, end of slavery was really a terrible thing, because the existence of slavery was, it's just, he just thinks the legislation, he sort of has all these explanations about why the legislation ending slavery was so terrible. I mean, there's some really vile stuff in here I'm not even going to read because it would be offensive to so many of the people listening. Well, here's one. This is interesting. Abolitionist leaders showed more hate than love on the whole. kind of amazing. I mean, he says, he claimed that the use of Black people as a political bludgeon against the Southern whites. I mean, it's just kind of incredible. Oh, and then here he says something else. Exchange slavery to an individual for slavery to the state. In both conditions, there are advantages, but both constitute slavery. Does that sound familiar? We just heard that from David Barton in the talk. So anyway, I could go on and on about Rushdoony, but I just want to bring up one other thing about Rushdoony. Another quote: he hated public education, absolutely hated it. And I should probably save this quote for later, but I'm going to read it here. He wrote, "I am as sure as I am of Christ's reign that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education separated from religion will prove the most appalling engineering for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of antisocial nihilistic ethics, individual, social, and political, which this sin-rent world has ever seen." So he hated public schools, and this is a theme that kind of I explored so much in my last book, but that you can see consistently throughout sort of Christian, the religious right has a sort of long-standing hostility to public education, and it goes very deep.
And goes right up to the present moment. I mean, Betsy DeVos.
Absolutely, it goes up to the present moment. Betsy DeVos, sorry.
No, and she just comes out of this ideology, this theology.
I know. So I want to show you another quote, and I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind me reading you quotes, but I always feel like you have to go to the source. So this pamphlet is a sermon of a fellow named D. James Kennedy. He was a very influential pastor, founder of Coral Ridge Ministries. He had a very, very popular radio show with a very wide reach. The DeVos family contributed at least $5.5 million to his ministry. So, so the sort of, this is sort of like, obviously if they're going to give him that much money, they approve of his message. So this is a screed he wrote about public schools. And here he writes, "The anti-Christian, anti-God bias, the censorship of all things Christian, the infusion of an atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, one-world, anti-American system of education in our public schools has indeed become such that if it had been done by an enemy, it would have been considered an act of war." So this is the dude that the family of Betsy DeVos was supporting, and this is what he thought of public schools.
And, I think it's fascinating. I mean, you almost said it as an aside, but here's this oligarchic family that gives $5.5 million to this preacher, and that's just minuscule. I mean, that's just a fraction of what the DeVos family gives and the Prince family gives. Again, just part of your book that I think is kind of fascinating is, and Rushdoony is an example of this, is if you met him, if he was your neighbor, if you knew him in person, kind, gentle, nice, loving, and yet this theology is harsh and punishing, and it's very clear as to who is pure and who is not. And now this type of religious fundamentalism has become utterly political today. If you are not towing the party line, you're the infidel. And so our politics has taken on a whole holy war character. And so I'd like to just turn a little bit to this, to dominionism. That's where I'm going with this. And for those who don't know it, and you can fill in the blanks, but there has been a very coherent strategy on the Christian right to become primary influencers in at least 7 different spheres, what they call spheres of power. Others call it mountains, the 7 mountain mandate. And those spheres of power, and wrote them, so I'll read them slowly. The sphere of religion and faith, that all things about religion and faith should be governed, if you will, by Christians, a particular kind of Christian. Another sphere is family. the family should be governed by the faith, by Christians. Education, government and law, the media, arts and entertainment, business and economics, basically all things cultural. Behind the strategic initiatives of the Christian right is a coherent ideology and strategy and end goal of what I would call bringing back a very harsh form of Christendom in this country, which when you say that, you sound like a nut. And yet that's what we're beginning to see politically unfold within the Republican Party. But what is dominionism? Why is this important for us to know?
I think you summarized what it is. It's this ideology that a certain type of believer should dominate all aspects of government and society. The important thing to know is that it's an anti-democratic movement. I mean, this is sort of the takeaway. It's anti-democratic because it's anti-pluralist and it's anti-equality. That's just sort of not, it's sort of antithetical to the principles that our founders baked into the Constitution. Principles that have been applied very imperfectly over time, to be sure, but they remain ideals that we should strive for. And to the extent that we pursue those principles, justice and equality, we advance society and do good things. And to the extent that we pursue the opposite, which is authoritarianism and the sort of idea of hierarchies of value, we spread injustice and pain.
You know, I'm struck again, this comes out of your book, it's not a direct quote, but that came home to me when, you know, the brilliance of American idealism, you know, starts right there in our sacred writings, secular sacred writings, when it talks about we the people. Well, we the people is antithetical to the Christian right, because we the people, which was such a revolutionary creation, a secular state, not governed by God, not legitimated by the authority outside of ourselves. We the people is and again, the Republican Party continues to chip away at this, but it's no, everything is God first, and it's God's word and God's revelation. And it reminds me so much of the of what we it reminds me so much of what we've learned about radical Islam. It's just a mirror image of it. And we have our own little schools now where we're educating kids from the ground, from conception on up, into this very radical and very anti-democratic, anti-pluralist understanding.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to talk about other parts of radical religions in other parts of the world. I mean, right-wing authoritarians and authoritarian regimes always run these sort of identity campaigns. There's a kind of we that's under threat, a they that they hate, and religion plays this role in distinguishing between the two. I mean, we think about, let's look at Franco in Spain, to Salazar in Portugal. You know, right-wing strongmen all over the world have long relied on alliances with conservative religious movements to sustain their strict regimes. As a way of, religion becomes a way of shutting down dissent, of ensuring conformity and unity, stripping people of their rights. And in the end of the day, I think organized hypocrisy actually takes the place of religion.
Right. Well, let me scale back and maybe into the weeds here a little bit, but if you would, I mean, and you've brought it up, you've already talked about this a little, but moderate and liberal churches have nothing like the infrastructure of the Christian right. We're not even in the same ballgame at all when it comes to mobilizing for political power. And you spend a chapter on the Blitz, is where I'm going with this. And you call that the playbook for a nationwide assault. And this has more than just mobilizing votes for a president. This is about the dog catcher. This is about city council. This is about state legislators. I mean, it is micro. And so can you tell us about the Blitz and the importance of it, because it is present right here in this state?
Well, I'm sure some of you are familiar with organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's also called ALEC, or there's this anti-abortion movement called Americans United for Life. These are organizations that craft pieces of what they call model legislation. That is, they'll get together and they'll, people will sort of put together a piece of legislation. And this allows legislators, multiple legislators from different states, to easily adopt and introduce bills in their states without needing to research and write the bills themselves. It kind of gets everyone with the same political vision on the same page. So Project Blitz works along similar lines. The idea is to overwhelm state legislatures with so many religiously oriented bills that some of them can be expected to get through, and then the debate over those issues gets shifted to the right. The architects of Project Blitz organized the legislation into 3 different categories, starting with the easiest and ending with the sort of what they knew would be the most difficult to get passed. And the hardest, stuff to get past, they knew, was going to be to get a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against certain other groups and conflate in the minds of the public their religion with the authority of government. So all of these bills are kind of a way of signaling to everybody through the law that there's a certain group that's privileged in society and other groups that are not deserving of privilege. Now, the first level, which they said will be the easiest to pass, and it'll be harder for liberals or progressives or even people who just believe in the separation of church and state to oppose, are these sort of In God We Trust bills. We want to allow outside groups to place In God We Trust bills in every public school. We want to make it mandatory for every public school building in our state to have an In God We Trust sign. We want to make it mandatory for every public school classroom or even every police car to have an In God We Trust sign. So a lot of people might see these bills in a kind of siloized or one-off fashion. They might say, what's the harm of allowing a group like the American Family Association to put their In God We Trust sign in public schools? It's all right. What's the harm in it? But what the architects of the Project Blitz know is that these kinds of initiatives will pave the way for the next layer of bill, which is to institute like specifically a Christian Heritage Week in public schools or things like that. Not a religious heritage week, not a sort of like, a faith heritage that we can all celebrate our heritage. No, specifically celebrating one type of heritage and also celebrating it from a particular politicized viewpoint. And then of course they want that sort of license to discriminate legislation to pass. And it's a very sophisticated document. They actually had a playbook that has gone through a number of different iterations. For a while it was available online, which was wonderful. And then when it started getting written about, I don't think you can find it anymore. They also actually, I think mistakenly probably, made several audio calls available to the public. So I was able to listen to them. And you could really hear a lot of the interesting sort of strategy discussions that were around the Project Blitz.
This, and again, I think this is what, I think this is one of the things that we do need to come to grips with, is that the micro nature of the larger agenda of the Christian right, because we can get caught up in Trump, and he's pretty hideous, and the party is moving towards that as well. But the Lord could call Donald Trump home tomorrow, and this doesn't go away.
It's true. The movement preceded him for decades, and it will long outlast him. This is not just about Mr. Trump.
You're right. And they're kind of, I mean, they just keep, they are masters. The Christian right are absolute masters at developing a farm system. They take, you know, young talent, fresh out of college. As a matter of fact, while they're in college, with internship programs and training and teaching. And if you've got talent, you've got a future in the Republican Party. You state I think it's in chapter 4, in a chapter called the Church and Party in Unionville. You state the foot soldiers of the movement, the many millions of church goers who dutifully cast their votes for the movement's favorite politicians, who populate its marches, flood its coffers with small dollar donations. Those are the root source of the political strength, but they are not the source of the ideas. And you illustrate this with the story of a fellow named J.C. Church, great name, and his multi-ethnic awake strategy. Again, I think this helps flesh out the amazing micro nature that we're dealing with.
Yeah, well, Awake 88 was started by J.C. Church. He's a pastor and political activist. Right now, he serves as Family Research Council's National Director of Ministry Engagement. So about 14 years ago, and he told this story at the church in Unionville. He's one of the speakers. He was actually very impassioned and fiery, wonderful speaker. So he told the story about how he packed his family into a motorhome and by his own account drove 14,000 miles up and down the state of Ohio and he claimed to have visited 2,500 churches in 88 counties to get pastors connected and politically engaged. So by his own account, he would meet with them and say, we all got to get on board, and definitely targeted not just white pastors of white churches, but also pastors of color who are theologically, conservative in certain issues. So he does have a kind of multi-racial approach. Although, of course, we can talk about that, and I'd love to talk about sort of racial makeup and racial politics of the movement, but we'll set that aside right now. That initiative called Awake 88 is still in place today. So the website for Awake 88 offers timelines, tools, and messaging videos and other kinds of support for pastors to help them turn out their congregations to vote. The website says, we'll help you mobilize the voters in your church, and they offer that church voter lookup, which of course Bill Dallas sort of has discussed as one of their Project 75 tools. So you can kind of see how a lot of these initiatives work together. I mean, that's the thing about the movement. There are all these different organizations and all these different individuals, and they appear to be pursuing sort of separate things, but then they all kind of come together in unity in ways that kind of increase efficiency.
Mm-hmm. One of the powerful chapters in your book is on abortion, and so I've got so in your chapter on abortion, you make a really stunning statement. You said the movement, the Christian nationalist movement, settled on abortion as its litmus test. It then set about changing the religion of many people in the country in order to serve its political ambitions. From the beginning, the abortion issue has never been about abortion. It's always been about dividing and uniting to mobilize voters for the sake of amassing political power. You then go on to tell a fascinating story about the issue of abortion, which into the 80s actually had a common consensus among Republicans and Democrats, only to evolve into an issue of deep emotional conflict. And yet the real threat at the heart of the anger was the desegregation of schools in the South. And then later in your book, you say multiple studies show that increased contraceptive access, including better insurance coverage policies, over-the-counter availability, comprehensive sex education, the things that work. But anti-abortion activists are not interested in any of that. in lowering.
They try to hamper some of those policies, which is shocking if you really want to, reduce the numbers of abortions. You think that they would support policies like, affordable family planning services and real sex education that sort of helps people understand that, how to avoid making a baby if you don't want one and things like that. So, but in fact, they tend to stand on the opposite side of that.
So how did that, that became the can opener. That's the wedge issue of wedge issues. It still is today. But that is really that's what mobilized the foot soldiers.
Right. They know, the leaders of the movement, if you can get people to vote on a single issue, a single binary life or death issue, you can control their vote. And then you can call the politicians benefiting from those votes pro-family, even as they're promoting social and economic policies that are intensifying inequality, hollowing out the social safety net and public goods like education and healthcare, and actually making it harder for America's families to succeed. So I love when you talked about the history. We have to remember when Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, Protestant leaders by and large welcomed the decision. Now there was always some dissent and some difference of opinion in these issues. But a lot of it fell down around faith lines, like it was tended to be seen as more of a Catholic issue, the opposition to abortion. Most Protestant Republicans supported it. A wire service run by the Southern Baptist Press ran an editorial saying that the decision was an advancement for religious liberty and human equality and justice. And that position was really not exceptional at the time. The SBC had actually endorsed resolutions that allowed abortion to preserve, they said, the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother, in addition to other instances. So we have to think about like what some of the Republican leaders said about abortion at the time. Ronald Reagan signed the most liberal abortion law into the country when he was governor of California in 1967. And Betty Ford hailed Roe v. Wade. The passage of Roe v. Wade is a great, great decision. My favorite little fun fact is that Peggy Goldwater, Barry Goldwater's wife, he's this great conservative hero. She was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Can you imagine the spouse of a Republican leader today saying, yeah, I don't just believe in reproductive choice. I'm actually going to go found a family planning clinic, But what happened is over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party because the movement really needed an issue to unify around. So there's a kind of group of leaders of this sort of reactionary political movement. They called themselves the New Right. They included like Paul Weyrich, Heritage Foundation co-founder. They included Southern Baptist televangelist Jerry Falwell, Howard Phillips, Phyllis Schlafly sort of had some involvement with them, and many others. And they came together to sort of ignite a kind of hyper-conservative counter-revolution. They were very unhappy with the leadership of the Republican Party at the time. They thought they were soft on communism. They were really, really upset about the fact, as you mentioned earlier, that the IRS was starting to look at the tax status of racially segregated academies that many pastors were involved in. And the IRS was starting to say, wait, why are we giving you tax benefits? You're segregating these children by skin color. This is not acceptable. And they were really offended by that. Bob Jones, the famous segregationist, was really, he was the author of this horrible sermon called "Is Segregation Scriptural?" And he called segregation God's established order. And they were really upset about the fact that Bob Jones University was starting to get, the tax status might be challenged. But, this wasn't going to be a really attractive issue for them. They knew it wasn't going to play well in public. So they thought, well, they thought about some other issues that they could use to animate their movement. They thought about the issue of school prayer, and they, really upset about the women's movement, the civil rights movement. But when they got to the issue of abortion, it was almost like a light bulb went on. And they were like, that could work. So then over time, it was going to take some work. And Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly, played a huge role in purging pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. She's written a kind of fantastic as a historical document, a book about how she did that very consciously and deliberately over time. And it was also a way of unifying conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants, and bringing in, as one of the other members of the New Right said, some of our fringe friends, as a way to bring together these disparate groups. And at long last, they kind of have created what appears now like a sort of pro-life religion. It's almost as though they've reduced all of politics to religion, to the question of, to the religion, to their religion, and then all of religion to the question of abortion. So,
this might be above both of our pay grades, but there is that. I think it's a very practical question, but also philosophical. There is that question that any person of faith, and certainly communities of faith, have to wrestle with, and that is, if you really, really believe what you believe, if you really, really believe what you believe, well, don't you want that for everyone? Because if everyone had it, the world would be full of flowers and peace and love and harmony. And because you might not believe what I believe, I somehow have to put a hedge around you. And so I have this bit of sympathy in me, because whether you're from, politically speaking, whether you're from the right or the left, so often you're driven by religious passion. And yet, again, to come back to maybe toot America's horn, ideally, it's fallen apart in so many particulars, but ideally, we attempted to create a nation that had the humility to tolerate disagreement and not to reduce our faith to one issue or two issues. And so,
but it's also, I think it's really important to remember that how diverse Christianity is. I mean, when the public schools started, in the very beginning, Congregationalists quickly seized control, and other groups got really upset. The Lutherans were like up in arms, and Baptists and Catholics were, felt like they were, that they were teaching, Protestant stuff in the public schools, and when Catholics started to immigrate in large numbers to our country, things went kind of haywire. People forget that people fought and died in the streets in, I think it was in the 1840s. Over a summer, there were a couple of weeks in which there were street battles over the issue of reading from the Dewey Reams version of the Bible, this sort of Catholic version, in public schools, and dozens of people were killed, and other numbers were maimed. They were there was, in Cincinnati, they called them the Cincinnati Bible Wars. In Boston, a little boy named Thomas Wall was told by his priest not to read from the Protestant Bible and the King James Version in the public school. And he refused, and he was beaten for 30 minutes. And the next day, I think 400 boys walked out of the school. It was called the Elliott School Rebellion. I mean, questions about just Christianity and distinctions of theology in public schools have riven our country and so many others with, I mean, let's think about the 30 Years' War. I mean, let's think about what's happened in Ireland. Just because everybody's sort of nominally a member of the same faith group doesn't mean that they're going to always be in agreement. So, our country was founded as an explicitly secular republic, a non-religious republic, I should say, neither affirming nor denying anybody's faith, but actually built on an idea of pluralism and equality. And that's the only way it can be. Our country's irreducibly pluralistic.
And that's what's at stake when a person like David Barton gets up and has so influenced the Christian right to talk about this being founded as a Christian nation. and because it just gnaws away at any semblance of a common good we're going to have. We have 1,000 questions on the Q&A, so Mike's voice is going to jump in here, and he's going to start bringing some of those questions into play.
Great.
We have a lot of.
Oops, sorry.
We have a lot of great questions. We have a lot of great.
Got it.
Turn it off. Muted. All right, here we go. We have a lot of great questions. First one's going to be from Dave Baylor, Cheryl Young, and Doug Ogden. Question is, the questions are essentially, where does the left and the mainstream fit into this? What are the responses? What are the strategies that are effective in reversing this influence? What chinks might there be in the armor of the religious rights, nationalistic policies and strategies? Where do we go? What are some strategies? Where do we go from here?
So I think there are things that individuals can do. I think there are individual solutions, and there are also collective solutions. You know, and what the right has done really well is they've created a positive voting culture, and they know the importance of unity when necessary. And I think that's a lesson that all of us could take in. You know, hold yourself accountable to vote. Hold your friends and family and fellow congregants, or people that you know, accountable to vote. Volunteer to babysit somebody's kids if they need that. Volunteer to drive people to the polls if that's what they need. Those are sort of on the individual side of it. On the collective side, I mean, there's so many different organizations that one could be a part of. I can't sort of advocate for any single one of them, but they're all important. Some of them are focused on racial justice and equality. Some of them are focused on, specifically on voting issues like trying to end race-based gerrymandering or race-based voter suppression, and trying to hold legislators accountable to sort of fix some of those problems. I think it's important to get to know your local lawmaker and really to be in touch with sort of what's happening in your community, because all of it matters. There are, of course, progressive and media initiatives and messaging initiatives and data initiatives and get out the vote initiatives. And it's really important to, just find places that you feel comfortable. There's like no one solution for that's going to work for all people. The right knows that. So if you're really interested in the abortion issue, you can get involved in an anti-abortion organization. If you're really interested in, I don't know, any number of other anti-marriage equality, if that's, people get involved in that level. I mean, they really, are great at turning their folks into activists. And I think that, here's the really important issue. They are a minority of the population, but I think a mistake a lot of people make in America is that they think that majority rules, and it doesn't. In a country where 40 to 50% of people don't vote, and an additional number have their vote suppressed because of gerrymandering or voter suppression or dirty tricks like the one we just saw in Atlanta, you don't need a majority to win elections. All you need is a very committed minority in order to win the elections. They're very strategic about how they devote their resources. They really figure out, how many resources we need to devote to this particular slice of this particular district in order to peel off enough votes to swing the state, to swing the election. So like when I went to that event in North Carolina, it was held in a swing district, and it was one of the swing districts upon which those sort of midterm elections hinged, in that state. So being strategic is really key. Something I see a lot of on the left and that I find concerning is that there's a lot of sometimes like infighting because this isn't my favorite candidate, or I don't like something they might have said in 1986. You know what? sometimes it's really important to look beyond the individual candidate and the things you might not like about that person and think about judges. This is something they say. They say this election is about judges, judges, judges. Think about it. Trump has put his stamp on over 22% of the federal judiciary because of the number of judicial appointees he's made. So a lot of folks, there are some people who don't particularly love Trump, but they will vote for him because they're voting on the issue of judges and these other things that they're getting. And I think it would be very smart for those who oppose the politics of conquest and division to do the same, like look at the big picture. And so I hope that answers your question. Oh, I think, read my book because it kind of offers a playbook for how they've done it. That's, what I wanted to show. I really wanted to show the machinery of the movement. And I think it kind of shows the different components of it. And so I think we can't really meet the challenges that we faced without knowing what we're up against. And so, educating yourself about what we are up against on the granular level, I think can be very helpful.
Next question would be from Dave Richardson. There's always been a continuum of debate between Christians on the right, on the left, the Orthodox, the autonomous, the progressive, the conservative. How can one sort out this discussion without an either or judgment about these polarities?
Well, it's interesting. I can't comment on the merits of different theologies. I can certainly comment on how the relationship between religion and government has shifted over time. But I'd love to hear more about what specifically you are referring to, I guess.
Well, I can't speak for Dave,
Okay.
but I think it might have to do with this discussion being so polarizing, and the worry that we're putting all of the emphasis on one side.
It's really hard to talk about the political actions of religious groups because it sounds as though you're bashing religion, but there really is a difference between talking about the political actions of a religious group, very concretely, like they're, turning out elections for a particular variety of candidate and talking about faith, but there really is a difference. So,
next question. If pastors and churches are actively being involved in directing folk on how to vote, how does that square with churches being nonprofits and not engaging in political activity?
It's a really good question. It's very hard to challenge that because it's politically toxic to take it on. And back in, I think it wasn't that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a sort of a Senate Judiciary Committee, maybe it was like 2006 or so. They were looking at about 7 or 8 of these like mega preachers, including Paul White was one of them. I believe Creflo Dollar might have been another one. There were about 6 or 7 of them. There was a guy who owned and leased airplanes. What's his name? His name escapes me. He was one of these super rich guys. He's actually sort of pretty connected to the Trump administration now. They were looking at what they had, the multiple houses, the airplane leasing companies, the private planes, the boats, and the like. And they started to say, we need to understand, why is some of this stuff tax exempt? Does it count as really religion, or is it part of, growing wealth? And there was it was a Republican group that was doing this. I actually describe it in my book somewhere, but I don't know the page number, so I'm not going to turn to it. But it's in, I believe it's in chapter 11, no, maybe chapter 10. And they started to look at it as a bunch of Republicans who wanted to, it was in the interest of fiscal responsibility. And there was such an outcry, they really had to back off. And they concluded at the end that, well, these folks are going to just have to police themselves. And they said, well, we urge you to police yourselves. And, that didn't work out terribly well. But there's another interesting couple that I featured in my book. And it's like one of these things where you look up so much information about a person, you spend days and days on it, and you can only really get a paragraph into it about it into your book. But it was this couple that started sort of like a religious broadcasting, I think it was called Trinity Broadcasting. They had dozens of houses, and they called every employee of their group ministers. So they all got tax exempt housing, and it was just, they had so much money, it was unbelievable. They were just, and some of that money went, I think about $400,000 actually went to pay out an alleged, affair, and whatever, not gonna go there. But they were just living very, very large, as you can imagine. So, but it's very hard to take that on because it becomes very politically toxic, and certainly the right will scream, you're stamping on our religion. The persecution narrative is so valuable to them because it's how they build their base. It's part of reinforcing this idea of the us versus the them. They've actually convinced themselves, some of them, that they are the most persecuted group in America. And so whenever people start to sort of challenge the tax exempt status of groups that are really politicking from the pulpit, they just scream and they say, oh, they howl, oh, they're persecuting us again. There's another fellow I wrote about in the book, Jack Hibbs, who actually he kept baiting the IRS. He was like, I'm going to give a really political speech, and he actually sent a copy of it to the IRS, baiting them to take it because they knew how much capital, how much sort of political capital they could get out of that type of persecution messaging. The IRS didn't take the bait. They were like, nah, we're not touching this one. It's tough.
This question comes from Reverend Jeremy Smith. When Trump stood in front of St. John's with the Bible, some said this is a symbol to Christian nationalists, that he continues to be their warrior in office. Is that how you would interpret that action from your lens?
That's a really interesting question. So I think there were two components to that Bible photo op. The first one was, wielding the Bible as a symbol of division and aimed squarely at the Constitution. It was basically saying, we are a Christian nation. It's us versus them, the believers and the non-believers, the insiders and the outsiders. Most politicians who pick up the Bible take the trouble to read it. Not Trump. He just took it out of Ivanka's designer handbag and sort of held it up as a symbol. I think all political leaders have appealed to religious symbols and religion at times to unite the nation, and to sort of refer in some ways to sort of commonly held values, or they surround themselves with representatives of various religions in order to signify a kind of interfaith unity. And Trump didn't do that. He stood alone. So this was one part of the symbolism of that moment. But I think actually the most important part of that symbolism is that he directed William Barr, our Attorney General, to call in the military to clear the square of peaceful protesters with rubber bullets and pepper spray, including clergy of that church. In order so that he could have his moment. So what Trump was signaling with that operation, calling in the military to clear the peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment right with weapons of the military, is he was signaling his willingness to use the military to defeat and to squash his political opponents. And that was actually a very scary moment. And I think that there has been some backlash among some Republicans and some even conservative, moderate or conservative leaning members of a faith community, because that's religious nationalism in a nutshell. Sort of combination of, a certain type of religion, sort of militarism, and a certain idea of patriotism. It was a very alarming moment. It was not politics as usual. It was really something. Now, of course, Trump's most loyal supporters loved it. Tony Perkins praised it. Robert Jeffress praised it. I believe it was Franklin Graham who praised it too. And a number of the rank and file saw it and just thought this was fantastic. He stands for us. In a way, people often accuse the left of playing identity politics. Oh, the left is always in this identity politics. The right plays it better. It's us versus them. He's fighting for us. He's fighting for our tribe. He's going to vanquish our enemies, and he'd be very happy to stamp on the Constitution if it stands in his way.
This is an anonymous question. Says, people I know who are on the religious right, including family members, are on the surface very nice people, personally kind, they help their neighbors, they're nice. Yet they support what seem to me to be harsh and uncompassionate policies. Can you help me understand this?
Oh, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I agree with you. A lot of people I've met in my travels are really nice people. They, I have family members too who sort of adhere to this, would fall into this category, who are just really lovely people and kind. They, are kind to their neighbors, and they, care about their communities. They can be, on a personal level, very generous, and yet all of their efforts are being harnessed in service of this agenda that's dividing our country with animus and degrading our politics and empowering an extraordinarily corrupt and I think dangerous leadership. I think that, how to understand it? I think we can't overlook the role of the right-wing propaganda sphere in all of this. Once you the right-wing propaganda sphere, this including multiple platforms from, Fox television on over, off to the right, Breitbart, and then it goes on and on. QAnon is sort of, overlapping with some of that stuff. They work really hard to separate the people who follow them from the facts. Because if you can separate people from commonly agreed upon facts, you can control their behavior. And I think, frankly, that's the best way to understand it. Like, when I find out about certain family members, and I'm thinking, like, where are they getting their information? And I see they're getting it from, like, I don't know, Breitbart. Well, they believe it, and they don't understand fact checking. So that's a way to understand it. It's like the influences that they're soaking up in the media that they absorb, and that's actually sent their way. Because we all know that thanks to Facebook feeds and things like that, different actors can sort of direct different types of information to people. I hope that helps. I'm sorry.
How does this group of contemporary white authoritarian Christians justify the oppression of African Americans, African American Christians, who are one of the most churched groups in the country within their theological view? Has it evolved from slavery and Jim Crow? How has it evolved? Can you speak to that?
I really appreciate you bringing up that question, because that's something we really need to talk about. So the movement, I think, is certainly an implicitly white. In some places, it's explicitly racist. But in a lot of places, it's more like an implicit racism, because it ties the idea of America to very specific cultural identities and religious identities. I think for a lot of the white people in the movement, they don't think of themselves as racist, but they're tying the idea of America to religious and cultural identities that are more implicitly white than explicitly white. And of course, Trump won because of the racism of a lot of his supporters. He overtly appeals to that. But, the movement leaders have actually, they can see the demographic futures clearly as you or I can, and they realize that they want to, they become eager to draw in some pastors of color, especially conservative-leaning pastors of color, in order to peel off a certain percentage of their voters. So I think they're having more success among Latino evangelicals and Pentecostals and Catholics, of course, than they are among Black evangelicals. But they're trying to capture that subsection of votes, and I think a lot of those movement leaders are also eager to guard themselves against accusations of racism, given the history of the movement. But the fact is, they're papering over, number one, the ways in which hyper-conservative religion and racism reinforce one another. It's that insider versus outsider thing. They're papering over the ways, and the fact that their movement is driving, engaging these pastors and people in the culture wars that drive support for a political party that is engaging in race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression as a strategic imperative. I mean, if you look at what happened in majority Black or largely Black voting districts in the elections, where it's, people are waiting in line for 3 to 5 hours in order to cast their vote. That's not democracy. That's absolutely not okay. And they are, of course, overlooking the fact, they might say they're not racist, but they're overlooking the fact that Trump has benefited hugely from the racism of so many of his supporters.
Maybe a last question. It's big and broad, and it's the very last chapter of your book, and it centers around the World Congress of Families, if you want to get your thoughts organized, and the growing connections of the American nationalist movement with Russia, etc. But you mentioned it a little bit in your opening remarks. It's just astonishing when we look at the globe. Bolsonaro aligned with radical evangelicals in Brazil, and you've got the Law and Order Party in Poland and Orban in Hungary. You've got, I think, Inez in Bolivia, Putin with the Russian Orthodox Church. One would think that the church, the moderate and liberal church, would be talking a little bit more about this merging of Christianity with authoritarian governments. And you touch on that in the last chapter of your book. And so as maybe the last question tonight, tell us more about that World Congress of Families and what you think is going on with the global religious nationalist movement.
Yeah, I mean, so I went to this annual conference of what they call the Global Conservative Movement. It's a really euphemistic. It's called the World Congress of Families. It was held in 2019 in Verona. So I went there to sort of learn a little bit more about these alliances. I heard a right-wing popular American radio host talk about the common enemy that they all shared as the anti-cultural processes of globalization and its secular aristocracy. I mean, there was a familiar hit list. They're against liberalism, democracy, really. They of course, are always hitting on the radical feminists and the abortion industry, or what they call the LGBT totalitarians. But really, it's a kind of unmistakably theocratic vision. This is an organization that got its start over 20 years ago, when American and Russian activists gathered in Russia and forged connections. And over time, this sort of evolved into this conference that takes place sometimes every year or like every few years. But, it's clear that it was not aimed at sort of increasing the sort of commonly held values of equality or democracy or representative government that America is founded upon. I think we have to note that religious nationalism of this type in practice almost never ends up in a genuine theocracy. So a lot of people say they're theocrats, and yes, we can say that they are theocrats, but this type of religious nationalism doesn't really end up in a genuine theocracy, and definitely doesn't end up in a Christian democracy. Its natural destination is a kleptocracy led by irrational and often nepotistic autocratic leaders. So, rather than uniting the populations, these governments tend to deepen existing divides. And the leaders of these movements or groups, when they win, they don't often have there's often massive opposition to them. And so what they'll do is they turn to religious groups to mask their lack of a popular support, and they turn to the military often. They'll turn to the military to squelch dissent. They end up jailing journalists or worse, and they literally demonize their political opponents, and forge their military alliances to advance their aims. So it's really quite concerning that under Trump, the United States has become the sort of flashing beacon of hope for this new tactical alliance.
Yeah, matter of fact, currently here in Seattle, President Trump is threatening to send in the military to quash a rebellion.
Oh my gosh.
And that's as we speak. I mean, this is in the air. I want to thank you. Wow, it's been almost certainly an hour and 40 minutes. And if you could just collect your thoughts for any final word you'd like to say to us, and I'll make 3 quick announcements, and then we'll come back and you can have the last word. For folks out there, just wanted to lift up again Katherine's book, The Power Worshippers, recommended highly. It's packed full of information, but what makes it so accessible is the stories that are told in it. And at least if you're anything like me, you begin to see the connections and make the connections. I thought it's well written. I'm very enthusiastic about the book. I also think her first book, the Good News Club, which is about how child evangelism happens in our public schools, is just crucial reading. And it's here. I mean, this isn't abstract. This is happening in our neighborhoods. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I wanted to let you know that those of you who live in and around Kirkland, Katherine and I were going to do this here before COVID hit. So I've got 2 boxes of her books, and graciously agreed to sell them for $20. They cost $28. And so if you stop by the church, we have these books, and I think we got about 40 or 50 of them. Secondly, just real quick, those of you who are interested in pursuing some more education, some more reading about Christian nationalism, starting with The Power Worshipper, starting with that book, Reverend Terry Stewart and myself are going to convene just a little book club that will meet on Sundays. Just drop me an email that's there on your screen. If you want to be a part of that, obviously it's going to be a Zoom group. And the third announcement was, the website, lakewahumc.org. We are recording this tonight, and if you want to pass this on to a friend, it'll be on our website. And so, Katherine, back to you, and anything that wasn't asked that you think is real important for us to know, or anything you'd like to add to just what has been a deep dive tonight. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to take this time to thank everybody who's participated in the conversation. If you didn't have a chance to have your question answered, I would be very, very happy to communicate with you. You can reach me through my website, which is katherinestewart.me, and there's a contact, and it'll send you a way to get in touch with me. I'd love to answer any questions that anybody might have, or I always like to hear people's stories. So please tell me about your experiences with this movement and with folks who are kind of fallen under its sway. And thank you again, Reverend. It was just incredible to be here.
Well, again, it's been a long day. It's a long night. You know, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your work. This is stuff we don't know and we need to know. And, you know, you're out there digging in the weeds. So, you know, thank you so much.
Thank you.